Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Angel.
Good morning.
Yesterday, when we left off, we were revisiting the incident that you described where your mother held a knife to her chest area. Do you recall that?
Yeah.
Now, is it possible that you might not have a strong sense of when exactly that particular incident happened?
Yes.
And is it also possible that the incident you described with your brother, or what you knew of the incident that just happened with your brother, might have been a different time?
It was very close to each other if it was different times.
Okay. And as far as your recollection of what you directly observed regarding your mother and a knife, was that the only time where you saw her put the knife to herself, that you saw her with a knife in her hands in that manner?
Object.
Basis?
I think at this point can we start it over?
Sure.
I'm just going to ask you that question again, okay?
Okay.
Is the time that you described to us yesterday where you saw your mom hold the knife to herself the only time that you saw her hold the knife in that manner to herself, yes or no?
That was on, yes.
And on that particular night that you described, you indicated in your prior testimony that you and your dad got the knife away from your mom.
Yes.
After the knife was away from her, did the police show up at your house that night?
I don't think so.
Do you remember discussing this particular incident, your recollection of this incident on a prior occasion?
Yes.
Would it refresh your memory if you're able to see your testimony from that
Yeah.
incident? Page 16.
What is he?
Angel, on the night that we're talking about, did you call the police?
I very rarely call police, so, I mean, I don't think.
Do you recall the police coming to your house at some point that night after things had settled down from that incident?
I don't remember the police that night at all. Like,
Do you recall speaking about this particular incident on a prior occasion?
about the police or the situation just in general. That's confusing to me. So
Okay, I can ask it again in a different way.
yeah.
Do you remember speaking about this incident closer in time to when it happened, or to when your dad passed away? And describing kind of what happened that night and what you observed. Do you remember talking about it before?
To somebody or like
In a prior proceeding?
I may have, but early on, things were so mashed up and I didn't now we have reference points of dates and stuff like that. So beforehand it was just all mashed up together. So I may have, but I don't recall calling police other than having my sister may have calling her on my phone or something. But
Okay, but do you have a belief that the police did or didn't show up, or you're not sure?
that I believe they weren't there at all.
Okay. Now, as far as not being sure about when this incident that you directly observed occurred,
Yeah.
have you reviewed anything to try to figure out when that date might have been?
I try not to think about things like that.
Okay. Do you remember talking about it with Katrina closer in time to when you observed that particular incident?
Yeah, I may have, yeah.
Okay. May I approach the witness?
Yes.
I'm going to show you something. I'm going to ask you to look through the first few pages to yourself silently.
Okay.
What's contained in those pages that you're reviewing, is it familiar to you? Just yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm going to draw your attention to page 14.
Okay.
You could look at that page and read it to yourself silently.
All right. Let me,
The pages and numbers are at the bottom.
yeah. Okay.
And after having reviewed what's contained in your reviewing, do you have a memory of speaking about this incident with a knife with Katrina?
Yeah. Yeah, this would be,
And is that, reviewing that information, is there any sort of date or time to that conversation?
5:10.
Objection, Your Honor.
Overruled.
May I be heard a sidebar just very
Certainly.
briefly?
Angel, now having reviewed that information, does that refresh your memory about when the event took place that you were talking about with Katrina?
I mean, for the most part, yeah. I mean, I still have like the memory of like bits and pieces of it, but like.
But as far as the specific date that you were discussing it with her, that it may be closer in time to when it happened, does that refresh your memory as to when that happened?
Yeah.
And when was that?
5:10, I believe it said 2018 on that. I didn't look at the last date. I was reading out the date right there and I didn't get to read
So
that.
I would object and I would move to strike under
All
the
right.
circumstances.
I'm not going to strike it. I will allow the Commonwealth to refresh with the document again and then take it away before you ask the question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Again, same.
Okay, I strike the last answer. Ask the question again, please.
Angel, does that refresh your memory as to the year?
Yes.
What was the year?
2020.
2020. Thank you.
No, my objection, Judge.
I do.
Now, yesterday you were also asked on cross-examination about your dad's drinking. Do you recall that line of questioning?
Yeah.
And you indicated that he typically drank like an 18-pack of beer.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, from 2018, when he started to go to AA on, did you see him drink beer after that?
If he did, it was secretive.
Okay. Did you have any reason to believe that he had relapsed in his sobriety after 2018?
It was very early on, if it did. So.
And closer to the time of his death in 2021, January of 2021, had you ever seen your dad drink then?
No.
Did you have any concerns that he had relapsed based on his behavior?
No. No.
Okay. You were also asked yesterday about your dad's friends and how he had I think you described that he had his sober friends and his other friends from before he became sober? Do you recall that line of questioning?
Yeah.
As far as the friends that he made after he became sober, did you see those friends come around the house often and hang out?
The sober ones, once in a while, yeah.
And your dad would go to the sober softball and all those events. Closer in time to his death in January of 2021, did you see those same people coming around your house, those sober friends?
Yeah.
Was he still actively engaged in all the social functions with the groups?
Yeah. That's what I remember, yeah.
Okay. And at that time, I think you testified yesterday that you were working kind of different types of schedules, though, for your job.
Yes.
You were also asked yesterday about seeing injuries to your dad's hands.
Yeah.
And I believe your testimony was that you described that the type of work he did, with pipes and stuff, he often would have kind of cuts on his hands.
Yeah.
When was the last time that he worked with the fire sprinkler company, if you can recall?
Objection, Your Honor.
Basis?
His statement that we're talking about is whether he worked with pipes, not whether he worked for the sprinkler company.
I'll allow the question.
Around the same time he was trying to reach sobriety, because he had to get rid of like the drinking buddies to reach his full sobriety that he needed.
Okay, so back in like 2018, 2019, he stopped working for Mark
I
McDonald?
believe so, yeah.
And in his role as a firefighter, right before he passed away, do you know what he was doing for the Boston Fire then?
He got promoted to, I think, assistant chief or driving around the assistant chief, or one of the two, for the chief at least.
So he wasn't on a truck going into the fires every day when he was on shift. He was driving around.
Towards the end, he was driving the chief around, I believe, yeah.
You were also asked yesterday about your mother and kind of her life with Zumba and the things she would do and how often she would do it. You recall that line of questioning?
Yeah.
And you talked a little bit about that she sometimes went on cruises and did activities with the Zumba groups, correct?
Yeah.
And you made a comment yesterday as to one of Attorney Wood's questions that she did those things, but it kind of progressively got worse. Do you remember saying that? What did you mean by that?
I mean, like, kind of like as the fights were going, it's like kind of as unhappy, like in the state of the house was going too. So it just progressively rolled up, like kept on going, like a just tumbling effect. And can you repeat the question just so I can finish that?
No, as far as your comment of what progressively got worse, I'm just asking, is it more related to the state of kind of what was happening in the household, or did it have anything related to her either participating or not participating in those types of events anymore?
Mixture of all of it. I mean, just some things she wouldn't like go to, and then like as I feel like it was like.
Objection, Your Honor.
I think he's answered the question. You can move on.
And as far as the trips that they used to do, is it fair to say that COVID kind of put a stop to a lot of those travel plans?
Yeah, I mean, they tried their best when they could.
So could those cruises that she went on for weeks at a time been in before
COVID?
Before COVID, before stuff started to break down in the house, before 2018?
Pretty much, yeah.
And you also were asked yesterday about your mom and her support of your dad in going to therapy and going to AA. Do you remember that line of questioning?
Therapy, AA, yeah.
And I believe that you, in response to one of Attorney Wood's questions, you indicated that if your dad missed AA or therapy, that would lead to an argument, correct?
Not always, but there would be a talk about it, you know. So
Who would initiate that conversation?
I wasn't there for the start. It would just be mid-conversation is what I would hear, so.
Okay, and when you came in on mid-conversation, was it kind of a calm, mellowed conversation, or was it a louder?
Let her ask the question, then you may object.
What was the tone of the conversation when you observed it, if you came into the middle of the conversation?
I mean, wasn't happy, but sometimes scolding, sometimes.
Objection, Your Honor.
Overruled.
And then it would be just like, you just need to get on top of it. Like, you know, so.
And who would be saying get on top of it?
Pretty much my mom to my father.
And yesterday you were also asked on cross-examination about your mom having arthritis in one of her hands and that she sometimes wore something on her arm.
Yeah, like a support, to just hold it in place
Did you see her wearing it all the time?
for a lot.
Okay. Did you see that inhibiting her ability to do regular things around the house, or would she do her normal things?
It could stop her from doing certain things, yeah.
And which arm did she wear it on?
The left one.
Do you know kind of what hand she would often kind of use? What was her dominant hand?
I think she was a right hand when she would write.
Okay. Thank you. I have nothing further.
Recross.
Thank you. Morning again, Angel.
Good morning.
Yesterday you were clear. You don't know what day it was that your mother did the Japanese thing. Let's call it that.
Yeah,
Okay,
well,
right?
most of these dates,
Yeah.
most of these situations I don't have a date for, but I recall them, yeah.
But you recall the event, right?
Yeah.
And it's really, really clear in your memory that you got a call while you were at work, right, to come home because there had just been a big
I believe,
fight.
yes.
And the big fight was between Michael Jr., correct?
Yep.
And your parents.
Yeah.
And Michael Jr. had left the house and he had broken his hand.
Yes.
And when you got home, Michael Jr. was at the hospital.
I believe so, yes.
And so, although you don't know what date it was, and you just saw a bunch of text messages with Katrina, you know that the events that you talked about with regard to the Japanese event, the Japanese pokey event, was on the same day that Michael Jr. broke his hand.
Yes.
That much is clear to you.
I believe so. That, because everything seems, it was like a week span, I would say.
Yeah.
So,
But even so, you know that on the day in question, you came home from work
Working
because
that.
you received a text about the fight.
yes. Yes.
So there's no question that it was on the same day that the fight happened that you came home and saw that.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now, you mentioned during redirect that he had stopped working for, I think you said Mac at MCC.
Yes.
In October of 2018, thereabouts.
Could be, yeah.
Yeah. And that wasn't the end of his work doing sprinkler work, right? He did some independent stuff, didn't he? On his own?
He may have.
Didn't he at some point, like when you remember, don't you, that like during a large part of, that period of 2018, your dad actually drove an MCC truck. Remember that?
Yes.
And at a certain point, he stopped working for Mac, right?
Yes, and he was,
And he returned that truck, didn't he? It was like a couple months later that he returned the truck.
Yeah.
And do you remember one of the big controversies about having to return the truck was that he was using the truck for doing independent work?
Yes. That
And
makes
so
sense
he
now.
ended up going and buying his own truck or getting his own truck so that he could do that independent sprinkler work, right?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. They mentioned a moment ago the thing about the cruises, okay? Can we all agree that the COVID situation, that didn't start in 2018, right?
The COVID? No. No.
That started in March of 2020, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. And so the affair is in October of 2018, right?
Yes.
Right. And so there were cruises before COVID, right, that your mother was both doing with Zumba as well as headlining with Zumba in the period from 2018 to 2020.
Yes.
Right. And it was in 2020 that things began to shift, right, in her business, and it became much more online.
Yes.
And that was the result of COVID.
Yeah.
And actually, COVID made her very much more busy because she could do a lot more remotely and from the house.
Yeah, you would, yeah. Yeah.
And starting in June of 2019, or a couple months after, she had that free room that Michael Jr. had moved out of, right?
Yes.
Right. So one thing I just want to shift back to the so-called Japanese event that you mentioned, earlier. One thing that you're also clear about that story, absolutely clear about, was that Katrina wasn't there during it, right?
Yeah, I don't, because she would have been right there in my face to even picture her there. So,
Right. And obviously, she wasn't there.
Yeah.
Yeah. How tall was your dad?
6'4".
Okay.
I think.
How tall was your mom? Was 5'2" sound right?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay. He's much larger than her, correct?
Yeah.
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 Okay. I have nothing further.
The witness may step down. Yeah. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
In a loud, clear voice, could you please introduce yourself to the jury and spell your last name for the record?
Chris Martin, Martin.
Where are you employed, sir?
Marshfield Police Department.
And how long have you been employed by the Marshfield Police Department?
Approximately 12 years.
And in what capacity have you been employed there?
Patrolman.
And are you currently still a patrolman?
Yes.
And what are some basic duties and responsibilities of a patrolman?
Traffic stops, responding to medicals, where we're dispatched, just responding to calls.
Sir, I'm going to draw your attention to the date of January 28th, 2021. Were you working on that date?
I was.
And what shift were you working?
The 4 p.m. to midnight shift.
In what capacity were you working that night?
As a patrolman.
Do you happen to remember the weather that date?
I believe it was cold, clear, temperatures in the 30s.
And at approximately 4:48 p.m., were you dispatched to a particular location, sir?
I was.
And what was the location you were dispatched to?
679 Moraine Street.
And what was the nature of the dispatch call?
I believe it came out as a medical and unresponsive male.
How long did it take you to respond to that address?
A few minutes.
And so after you heard the dispatch called 4:48, within a few minutes you had arrived at that location on Moraine Street?
Correct.
And were you working with a partner that night or alone?
I was alone.
And were you in a marked cruiser?
I was.
And in full uniform?
I was.
And were you the only officer to arrive at that time?
No, I arrived simultaneously with 2 other officers.
And what are their names?
Officer Kelly and Officer Hunt.
And sir, can you please describe your observations upon your arrival at 679 Moraine Street?
We entered the house, and it was kind of like a living room or a dining room off a kitchen. And there were 2 females in the kitchen area, as well as a male that was on the ground.
And with regard to the male on the ground, was he subsequently identified as Michael Ricci?
At that time, I didn't know his name.
Okay. And could you describe how he was on the ground?
He was laying face up on his back, didn't appear to be responsive.
Were his eyes open or closed?
I don't recall.
Okay. And you indicated he was not responsive?
Correct.
Okay. What, if any, injuries did you observe on him?
I didn't observe any.
What, if any, fluids or blood, for example? Did you observe anything anywhere?
No.
And you indicated there were 2 females in that general vicinity. Is that accurate?
Correct.
And were you able to identify who they were?
At that time, no. One being the caller. I didn't know their names at that time.
And were you able to subsequently figure out who the two women were in relationship to the male on the ground?
Correct.
And could you describe what you learned?
One was identified as Christine Ricci, the wife of the victim, and the other was Sophia, the daughter of both.
And do you see Christine Ricci in the courtroom today? You could stand up with Your Honor's permission.
You may stand up.
You don't see anybody that?
It's been 3.5 years, so I
Not a
gotta be
problem.
honest, I don't recall.
Oh, that's fine. But there was somebody that was subsequently identified as Christine Ricci?
Correct.
And could you describe her demeanor when you arrived?
Yep, she was frantic, hyperventilating, yelling, screaming.
And what about her daughter, their daughter, Sophia, the caller? How was her demeanor when you arrived?
I don't recall.
Okay. And upon your arrival with Officer Kelly and Officer Hunt, can you tell us what Officer Kelly did when he was on scene?
He began to render aid to the victim.
And in what fashion?
I believe he prepared, actually, I'm not sure. An ambu bag was prepared and chest compressions, I'm not sure.
Did Officer Kelly and Officer Hunt do those two things together?
Correct.
And what was your role at that time, sir?
I was just kind of overseeing if they needed any, like an extra hand with, getting something put together.
And at some point, did you speak to Christine Ricci?
Yes.
And what did she say to you?
She said that he was having a manic episode and then suddenly collapsed.
Were you able to understand her when she said that?
That part, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Were there other parts you were unable to understand?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot going on there. It was kind of a frantic scene.
And while Officer Kelly and Officer Hunt were rendering aid, namely, as you stated, chest compressions and I believe rescue breaths, what, if anything, did you observe on the ground near the alleged victim?
A 5-inch steak knife near his foot, approximately 2 feet.
And what, if anything, did you do when you saw the knife?
I didn't notice any blood or anything, but it had stayed there. At that time, again, it was still, in my mind, a medical.
And, okay. And based on your observations of what your fellow officers were doing, what was Michael Ricci being treated for?
Possible heart attack or something.
Objection, Your Honor.
It's all right, he can answer it. What was your understanding of what he was being treated for?
A heart attack.
Did anyone else arrive to 679 Marine Street shortly after you and your fellow officers arrived?
Yes, the fire department.
And what was their role, sir?
They took over care for the victim, placed him on a backboard, and started transporting him to the ambulance.
And where was the ambulance?
In the driveway. I honestly don't know. I never left the house, so
Okay, that's
I'm
fair.
not sure. I would assume the driveway.
And did you have any further conversations with Christine Ricci once her husband had been taken out of the home and brought to the ambulance?
We attempted to speak with her, but she was, again, still frantic, hyperventilating.
And at some point, did her demeanor change at all?
Yes, she was eventually, over time, able to calm down.
And once she became calmer, what, if anything, changed about her story that she had previously told about her husband and why he was on the floor?
Objection as to that characterization.
Sustained.
What, if anything, changed about what Christine Ricci had previously told you once she became calmer?
She told me that there was an argument between the two, And again, she feared that he was in a manic episode, so she grabbed a knife.
And that was, is it fair to say, let me back you up a moment. While you were speaking to Christine Ricci before those statements were made, did somebody come in from outside and make the officers aware of information?
Yes, a member of the fire department.
And if you know, was that Lieutenant Smith?
Correct.
And when, prior to Lieutenant Smith coming in, all the defendant had told you, is it fair to say, was that her husband had had a manic episode and collapsed, correct?
At that point, yes. Prior to fire coming back in, yes.
And then once fire came back in, without telling us anything that was said, did Lieutenant Smith tell your fellow officers something that he had learned outside?
Yes.
And once that happened, were you made aware of that information?
Yes.
And is that when you re-engaged conversation with Christine Ricci?
Correct.
And what did you ask her?
I again asked her what had happened, and at that point she explained in further detail that an argument had ensued between the two. She was, she believed he was becoming manic, so she picked up a steak knife because she was scared, and then at some point Michael lunged at her.
And what, if anything, did she indicate happened with the knife in her hand?
I don't recall. Oh, I'm sorry. It went into his chest. Yes.
And had you been aware, sir, of a stabbing when you first arrived, would treating Michael Ricci have been any different?
Yes.
In what way?
Again, we would have immediately handcuffed the defendant, knowing what had happened. Handcuffed.
Objection, Your Honor. As to this hypothetical.
Would the question was, would the treating of the individual, the male on the ground, have been different?
And that also calls for expertise that I don't know a foundation has been led.
I'm happy to lay a foundation, Your Honor.
All right, lay the
I would
foundation.
ask that it be stricken what's been said.
I will strike with regard the testimony with regard to the handcuffing. The question that was asked and the question that will be asked again is, would the treating of the individual male on the ground have been different if you had known that he had been stabbed?
And sir, in terms of your training and experience, when have you learned how to respond to an event such as a stabbing?
Yes.
And typically, what would that involve in terms of medically treating the person who's been stabbed?
Applying pressure to the wounds.
And did you apply pressure to Michael Ricci's wounds, either you, Officer Hunt, or Officer Kelly, when you first arrived?
No.
May I have one moment, please?
Yes.
Nothing further at this time. Thank you.
Cross-exam.
Good morning, sir.
Morning.
You stated on cross-examination, I'm sorry, direct examination, some things that I want to talk to you about right now. The first is a statement about when Ms. Ricci made the statement about the knife, okay? I'm going to talk about that with you right now, okay? It's your testimony today, if I understand it, that she doesn't say anything about the knife until after you talked to the fire department and EMTs. Is that your testimony for sure today?
One of the officers spoke with the fire department. I spoke with the officer who relayed what was said.
Okay. Do you remember testifying previously in a motion hearing in this matter? Earlier on, maybe
Yes.
2 years ago?
Yes.
Maybe when your memory was a lot clearer as to what and the events that occurred?
Potentially.
Yeah. Do you remember telling me during that hearing that When Kelly and Hunt brought the body out to the ambulance, you went into the kitchen with Ms. Ricci, sat her down in a chair. Do you remember that?
Correct.
Yeah. And she was upset, correct?
Correct.
So upset that she could not give a coherent account of anything, correct?
Again.
At first.
At first, yes.
Yeah. And she sat down and she ended up being given some medication, right, by her daughter?
I can't answer. I'm not sure.
You don't remember that?
Correct.
And you're aware that in the kitchen, while the two other officers are talking or are bringing the body out, you have a conversation with Christine Ricci when she's sitting in that chair, correct?
Yes.
Right. So this is the conversation you're having with all the other officers out at the ambulance. Now, it's just you, right?
Correct.
Yes. And it was during that time that you were with the defendant that you observed her taking medication. You say you don't remember that now. Is that right?
I don't recall, no.
Is that a transcript?
Yes.
We don't have a transcript.
So you're saying you don't want me to use this?
You didn't provide it.
I thought I had.
I'll see you at the side of the bench. All right. Thank you.
And you remember, sir, don't you, that it was in the kitchen that you began to have a further and more fulsome conversation with Ms. Ricci about what happened, correct?
Correct.
And it was during that conversation while the other officers were out at the ambulance that she makes the statement about the knife for the first time.
I believe Officer Kelly was with me when that statement was made. I don't think I was alone.
Okay. But it was before the people came back from the ambulance and told you about any findings, like, for example, from the fire department.
No. I learned about it when the fire department came back and relayed that information. That's when I further discussed what had happened.
Excuse me, may we approach her briefly?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, Jerry Entrance. This court's now in session. Please be seated.
Counsel, you may proceed.
Thank you, Ron. Good morning, sir, again. I apologize for the confusion. But I want to get back to January 28th, 2021, if I could.
Okay.
When you arrive, as you said, she's extremely upset, correct?
Yes.
Christine Ricci is hyperventilating.
Yes.
Crying.
Yes.
Screaming. And when you first have an interaction with her, that conversation that you have with her, she's still in that emotional state that you described during direct as frantic.
Yes.
Correct? And what you remember about what she said was something about manic attack, correct?
Correct.
And collapse.
Correct.
She could have said more, but that's what you were able to discern amongst the flood of words that were coming at you, correct?
Correct.
And much of it was muffled and difficult to understand because of her state of upset.
I'd agree.
And you, as a first responder, realized that it didn't make sense to engage in a long questioning with her at that point when she was still in the living room, dining room area, right?
Correct.
And that's why you brought her into the kitchen, correct?
Yes.
And you sat her down.
Correct.
Now, it's your memory, as on direct examination, that, and just correct me if I have this wrong or right, that the the officers take the body out to the ambulance, correct?
The fire department did. The officers did not.
Okay. The fire department brings the body out to the ambulance.
Yes.
And it's in the ambulance that the paramedics discover, you're saying, the stab wound, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So, and you and the defendant, correct? As well as Officer Kelly are in the kitchen at this point.
Yes.
Okay. And Officer Kelly had previously been sort of responsible for the CPR that was going on, right?
Yes.
And did you begin to talk to Ms. Ricci before Kelly was done doing the CPR in the kitchen?
Not beyond what I had ascertained, which was, manic episode collapse. So that was up until that point. That's all I had.
Okay. So from the moment that you're in the kitchen, the fire department has now taken the body out to the ambulance and you're alone with Kelly and Ms. Ricci in the kitchen.
Yes.
Do I have that right?
Yes.
Okay. And it's your testimony today, isn't it, that Ms. Ricci only states, I'm sorry, and so, of course, you don't find out about the knife until after the paramedics come back or the fire department comes back from the truck and have a conversation with you, correct?
Well, I saw the knife prior, but that's when I put it together that, maybe it was used and what happened.
But I guess my question is, you don't find out about the stab wound in the body until the paramedics come back to you,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Okay. When they're out at the truck, you don't yet know about the stab wound, right?
No.
Okay. And it's your testimony today, as if I understand you correctly, that you don't hear Christine Ricci, you don't have a conversation with Christine Ricci until after they come back and tell you about the stab wound?
Yes.
Okay. As I said a moment ago, you testified at a motion hearing, a preliminary hearing earlier in this matter, correct?
Yes.
A couple years ago,
Yes.
when the events were a lot clearer in your mind, correct?
Potentially. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Identifying document. What, last one? May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
One more. Sorry. And the first page of this testimony. Not going well today. May I approach?
Yes.
We're showing you a document here. Is that identified as that preliminary motion hearing that we talked about earlier?
Yes.
Okay. And as I turn, your name is right there, correct?
Correct.
In your testimony from page 16, correct? To page 35?
Yes.
Okay. Now, you're identified on page 6 as being the person testifying?
Yes.
All right. And you were asked the question on page 11, lines 13, I think, to 20. All right. Once the paramedics arrived and other officers arrived, what do you and other officers do? And you answered, well, they had taken the victim out into the ambulance. They had hooked him up an automated defibrillator, or not defibrillator, chest compressions,